A few years ago a new hiking buddy climbed up a waterfall, slipped on some pine needles on the top and fell 40 feet down onto rock. I was the first person there, blood pouring out of head, broken spine, shine broke through the skin. He bit below his mouth and pretty much had a second mouth. It took an hour or two for medics to get to us and another 2 hours to use ropes to lift him out of the valley to a helicopter. Miraculously, he was out of the hospital after a few months and eventually regained full movement. All medical experts were shocked he made a full recovery. Most traumatic event of my life by far. I was in the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho doing some biological survey work. We were 30 miles from the nearest trailhead and got an early start to avoid the heat. About a mile into our hike, we hear the bushes stir near the trail. Up pops a man wearing nothing but a loincloth and Nikes, carrying a very small bag and a hunting rifle. He says mornin' and takes off sprinting down the trail. Never did see him again, so many questions. I think this fits. I was on a long hike in the Oregon Cascades to a small lake. I came across a abandoned campfire that was spreading out from the rock ring. The area was about the size of a small car. I rushed to dig a fire break and ran up and down the hill to the lake for water. Took me about a dozen trips with my sleeping bag stuff sack to extinguish it. I was 100% sure a forest fire would have broke out. I was on a mountain rescue team for several years. Saw a lot of stuff, but one that stands out is a guy who fell over 2,000 feet off a cliff and onto rocks. Not pretty. Man, I did work with search and rescue in the Ruby Mountains and I saw some fucked up stuff. Worst one by far was a missing hiker we found, like 60% of his body actively being eaten by mountain lions. That made me lightheaded. Me and my friend had just set up camp and chilled for a little bit not far from an pretty overgrown trail that seemed almost abandoned and forgotten. We were spooked by a noise and it was a mountain biker coming down that steep and bad trail rather reckless. He then stopped, hastily pulled his shorts down and squatted down to spray diarrhea like crazy before he kept going. We were pretty camouflaged so he never noticed us watching. So about 5 years ago a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in the mid-spring. We were about 6 miles in from the road, nowhere near a trail on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree comes 2 guys and a dog. Mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They are wearing trail running shorts, running shoes, and a running water backpack. AKA, nothing of real use. "PCT open?" they asked. Friend and I looked at each other, looked at them, tried not to laugh and explained. "We are 5 miles from the PCT and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do?" They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains but got sidetracked due to snow. Again we explain that they are fucked. I tell them that there is a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks and if need be we can hike them out. They refused and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them, "You are fucked, let me hike you out." They were like, "Nah, we've got this," and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night and followed their tracks for a half mile the next morning. They disappeared, no signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to try to find a name. Nothing. It gets weird though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area again asking about a trail loop, same conditions. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road and they were lost. My dad also tried to hike them out but they denied and took off in the wrong direction. He followed their tracks for a half mile before he lost them. So if anyone sees the ghosts of the Oregon Cascades, let me know. My wife and I were hiking on a remote trail. I had to pee, so I stepped behind an evergreen and started to do my business. An about 60-year-old woman came out of nowhere, dropped her pants and peed. Right next to me. As in my junk was 30 from her face. We strangely watched each other pee while chatting about the hike. My wife saw this go down 10 years later and she can't bring it up without giggling. Edit. I don't know if I had picked a great tree or if she just wanted a look at some junk. Either way, total badass. I did a wilderness survival course when I was a teen, so I have a few of these. I've told the forest fire story a million times in similar threads. Probably next best one would be Giardia in a situation where we couldn't get medevac out there for quite some time. Giardia is already an awful thing to contract when you can have quick access to any semblance of privacy and comfort. But it's a camper's disease, so that's usually not true, and it wasn't here either. One of the girls got it, and by the time they called for medevac she had been mildly symptomatic for a few days, and because of weather condition they had to send a truck and it took quite some time. So she was in the thick of it for a couple days in the camp. We dug a separate hole for her to shit in. We all had to assist with her care but also keep away because of how crazy contagious it is. Edit. Crazy contagious if you can't stay clear of other people's poop, which we really couldn't, but because this was a treatment establishment, she couldn't be out of loss of staff for very long, so she basically just lived next to her shit trough. I think the scariest part for me was, initially, she was embarrassed. What teen girl, or anyone tbh, wouldn't be, if their peers had to hear and see them having explosive diarrhea into a hole? I heard her cry to staff about it, beg for privacy, etc. But the scary part was that by day 2, so much energy and life had faded out of her and she was so bad off that all semblance of embarrassment, shyness, etc., had completely left her. She just sort of laid next to the trough and kept her pants down and scooted backwards towards it when she needed to go. When she wasn't shitting she was in a lot of pain, so she'd just sort of lie there and moan. I genuinely thought she was going to die. Giardia isn't a death sentence at all, very survivable, but 15-year-old me didn't know that, and watching it happen was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. I had hiked in 15 miles to an alpine wilderness and just laid down for the night when a youngish guy in shorts and no bag pops out and asks me if I have water. I of course shared my water. He immediately said he had been hiking since yesterday. Apparently him and his friend went way back and off trail, skirting some cliffs along the way. Then he just says half jokingly, "Yeah, his brains are everywhere." I laughed half-assedly, but he was sending off a really deadly vibe, not dangerous, just stone cold shock. I asked him to clarify that last part, and offered him food and a cigarette. I also ordered him to sit down. He didn't want to because he would lose his legs if he sat now, but I explained he needed to sit a while. Long story short, his friend slipped and fell, and when he hit, his head popped and then his body got wedged in a crevasse. The guy I was talking to had spent all the previous day hiking around the cliff to find his friend, then had to hike out of the valley up the ridge and down again, all on tail slope off trail. He was absolutely shredded, skinned, tore up. He was begging me to come with him and help me get his friend out of the hills. That's the part that really stuck with me. He got up and was about 3 feet into the bush when I grabbed him gently and said, "Hey, I got a phone, we'll see if emergency service works." Somehow it did, and I have zero idea how, technically, or otherwise. We were standing in a glacial cratered alpine lake, 15 miles from the trailhead. I got rescue up there, and man, I was super impressed with their response. Within a few hours the first group of volunteers were passing my camp. These guys all looked like supermen, and they were. All night afterwards a constant stream of rescue volunteers. I stayed camp and made a comfy spot for them to rest on the way down. They had to wait up there in whiteout conditions for 6 nights, but rather than leave they kept a constant vigil over the hiker's dead body. When the weather broke, a chopper flew in and took them all out. I've never been so deeply moved and impressed with that kind of selflessness in something we regard as a hobby, a sport. Words that take away the very dangerous nature of it. Read all these stories and it seems most are deaths by slip and fall. Happens too easy, don't take the chance with your life. We were about 8 to 10 miles into the Wind River range when we decided to camp near a nice lake. We wanted to get off the trail and the lakeshore, so we walked up beside the inlet stream. There we found at least 100 piles of human waste plus toilet paper, not buried, and right next to a pretty stream. Disgusting. I walked past a campsite with a ton of smashed alcohol bottles and trash. Started feeling uncomfortable and walked faster to where the trail looked over a canyon. Smelled something bad and looked down to see, like 3 feet from me, 2 bloated dead dog heads sticking out from a rolled up tarp. Immediately turned around and booked it to my car. I called the Forest Service to report it. I think some people got drunk and killed the dogs, or maybe it was a dog fighting thing. There may have been more under that tarp, but I was freaked out. I think if it was someone's pets, they would have tried to bury them. Hiking a trail in Sedona alone, I heard a strange sound like thunder clapping. I stopped hiking, then a boulder the size of 3 basketballs comes bouncing down the mountain about 15 feet in front of me. Fucking yikes. I was on a trail in Ma when 2 teenagers on motorbikes came gunning through the woods. One hit a bump at speed and went flying one way, and his bike went another. He flew right into a tree trunk. He wasn't wearing a helmet. Neither of them were. I went over to see if I could help. I told him not to move and I'd get someone. He told me to go fuck myself and limped over to his bike, got on it and slowly drove off. His friend just looked at me and shrugged and drove off after him. A few days later I saw his friend in a convenience store. I asked him how his friend was and was told that he had died from his injuries.